broadband spirituality for the 21st century. So let's think about the question of, well, why even pursue a spiritual path? What's the purpose of doing that? And people may have very different answers to that. It could be, well, I'd like to find more peacefulness in my life. I'd like to find more clarity. I'd like to be able to cope with difficulties better. Or you might go, well, I would like to awaken. I remember when I got interested in spirituality when I was a teenager in college, reading books about enlightenment and Buddhism as well. I want to get enlightened, I want to be like the Buddha and so on. And there's many different purposes or reasons why somebody may get involved in a spiritual path. And there's kind of a correlation with what's happened with religion and I think what's evolving with spirituality. So let's back up and take a look at what's happened with religion over the centuries. Well, the model for mainstream religion, I would say generally, is based on a Newtonian model of the universe. Cause and effect, separation from some divine being that may or may not participate or interfere in existence. And the aim for different religions is often to ranges from getting saved to in some spiritual traditions, it could be, well, you want to get liberated from having to be in this world, which may be viewed as being Maya or illusory. Meanwhile, there's been a lot of advances that have happened in the world of science, and it takes a long time for discoveries of science, the thinking that goes with those discoveries, to be part of the mainstream. So most of you are probably at least a little bit familiar with quantum physics, quantum mechanics, which has been going on for about 100 years or so, that just kind of blew out of the water the Newtonian model of the universe, of the billiard ball model, of that if you could know in precise detail the position and the momentum of every particle in the universe, then you could just play out forward or backward the history of the past and everything that was going to happen in the future, which raised questions of, well, is there really any free will? No, that's an illusion, and so on. And quantum physics, there's uncertainty, there's the effect of the observer on what's being observed. And so scientists have discovered that the world that we actually live in is very different than the world that we think we live in. Now take that one in for a moment. What's he talking about? The world that I think that I live in? Well, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to this talk. What other world is there? What other way of being in the world is there? But we're all subject to our conditioning. And conditioning is our belief system, but it's also based on the experience of the physical senses. And it's also based on the, I would say, normative collective awareness that makes it very difficult to break out of that typical way of thinking about reality. And in fact, scientists from different disciplines have been saying for quite some time that we live in a deeply interconnected universe where everything is in relationship with every other part of the universe. And these relationships extend even beyond our usual notions of time and space. Wow, that's a big thing to try to take in. And so, well, if that's the case, then instead of the old model of the scientists in the white coat standing there objectively measuring and observing what's going on and having no effect on what's being measured, we're in the thick of things, and everything that we do affects everything that we're experiencing. So you might go, well, how could there be any possibility of understanding what this reality is about that we exist in? Well, there very much are ways of doing this, but they're different than the ways that we have been used to all of our lives. It's a relational way of experience and thinking as opposed to a dualistic, separated way of experiencing and thinking. So just even think about the experience of sitting with a beautiful rose. Well, what's likely to happen is we'll look at the rose and then thoughts will be there. Oh, that's such a beautiful rose. Look how red it is. Oh, it smells so wonderful, and the petals feel so soft, and look at how the bees are attracted, and just all the thoughts and the chains of thoughts that go with that. And we presume without questioning that our concepts about that experience are the actual experience of the rose. And in fact, they're not. I mean, the rose is something much more than what our thoughts are in response to the input of the senses, or even the thoughts that go through our mind, or even the emotions that we have in response to that. Well, I'll give you a little background about how I got interested in spirituality. I was at Caltech my freshman year, and even before the first courses started, I was browsing books at the bookstore, and I came across this little book called Gödel's Theorem. And Gödel was a mathematician, philosopher who proved this pretty simple theory. I mean, you don't have to be an advanced student of math or science or logic to understand his reasoning. But basically, he proved that in any system that has assumptions or axioms at least as interesting as the natural number system. So what are the axioms of the natural number system? Well, for any two numbers, A and B, A equals A plus B equals B plus A, and so on. Well, he proved that if you start with something at least that interesting, you can always make a statement that you can neither prove nor disprove based on your axioms. And this just threw a monkey wrench in my conceptions about what I thought I was going to get out of Western science, because I thought, well, here I am at one of the best schools in the world for science, and whatever field I decide to go into, I'm going to have the tools to discover everything that I want to know about that particular field. And before I even got started, here's this proof there's always going to be things that you can never know if they're true or false. And my mind's going, wait a minute, it has to be one or the other. No, you either adopt it as being true, and that's a new axiom, and now you have a new system, or you adopt it as being false, and that's another system with that. And that just was totally mind-boggling. So this is probably not your typical way of getting interested in Eastern spirituality and mysticism, but it's how I got interested. So I started exploring Buddhism and yoga and reading some ancient texts. And there was one by Patanjali called How to Know God. And Patanjali talked about how you could undertake practices to have a direct experience of whatever it is that you're wanting to know about, not separated from, but it was like becoming one with that. And he had statements in there like, if you can maintain this one-pointedness for 1 minute, then this amazing thing will happen. And if you can maintain it for 5 minutes, this even more amazing thing will happen. I'm going, 1 minute, 5 minutes, I can do that. Well, we think we can, but it's very difficult to just maintain focused attention without concepts for any significant length of time. But anyway, I started exploring all that. And I started reading about these great beings in yoga and Buddhism that had achieved enlightenment or liberation or the highest state of consciousness. And for many years in my spiritual life, I thought, well, that's what I want. That's the end zone. That's the goal of spirituality, to be able to enter into these states. And I worked with practices of meditation and learned how to get into some of these states of consciousness. And I thought, well, that's all that there is. But then I came across the teachings of Sufism, and Sufism is not a religion. It's not really any one particular tradition. The word itself, one root is Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom. But it's always been a tradition in which teachings have been taken from all the different religions of the world, the great masters and saints and prophets. So it's really a universal outlook. But the particular brand of Sufism that I have been studying for about 40 years, the aim was not to get away from manifestation, but the aim was to fully manifest the highest potentialities that we have. And there's different ways to describe that. One would be making God a reality in ourselves. And another way would be bridging the span between the manifest aspect of our being and that which is transcendent to that, but participating in the furtherance of what can be known as a result of the relationship between manifestation and what's transcendent. So I've given you a pretty rapid chunk of an introduction, so this would be one of the points I'd like to pause and hear questions that you might have or comments in response to what I've said. So if you're on the phone, you can just go ahead and ask. If you're visible, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So is this true? Yes. You're still muted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. So one of the things that I picked up there, Dr. Don, was when you talked about using the math axioms and what they permitted knowing and not permitted knowing, that in essence what I picked up from that is that you're talking about how the context or the frame determines the experience or the results that one experiences. Is that where you're going?
That would be one way of describing that it's all relational, and it's not, I mean, one state of, I'll call it the typical way of going around in the world would be feeling yourself as a separate being, and you're interacting with whether it's another person or something in nature or a situation, but you're separated from it and you're reacting to it. So that's one way of being, and the scientific analog of that would be it's a dualistic way of relating. The other end of the spectrum in spirituality would be just merging with the, whatever you want to call it, the transcendent, the one, the totality, and any personal identity has been totally dissolved, and you're not there anymore, but you're in this ocean of bliss and light and so on. And as I said earlier, for a good while in my early spiritual years of exploration, I thought, well, that was the point of it all. But then I realized, well, why bother having a creation or an existence in the first place if the whole point is to get out of it? You know, there must be some reason why there is an existence, and there must be some value that each of us has to contribute to that. And I came across this amazing Sufi named Ibn Arabi, who lived, I think, in the 12 or 1300s, who I think is probably one of the greatest mystics that's ever been. I mean, his writings are so deep. I mean, he was so far ahead of his time, and he probably still is. But one wonderful thing he said was that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has or will or could have access to. And another way of saying that is, because each of us is a unique being, as we unfold and awaken to our higher potentialities, and there's something that can only come through us, our way of relating to everything else, that can't come through anything else. And that's the contribution that we make to being in the world. So and I really hope we can have a good bit of interaction here, and it's not just me lecturing to you, because I'd really like to. Yes, Lee.
Well, you said that we experience reality, what our thoughts are, and that is not reality. And so what, you talked about duality, and you talked about, the oneness, but what do we replace that with?
I'm so glad you asked that question. A term that came to me some time ago, and I'm sure other people have different descriptors for the same idea, but it's what I call relational unity. So it's a way of being in deep relationship with whatever it is that we're experiencing that's not separated. We still have our personal sense of identity. It's not merged with it, but it's just very, you could say, co-permeable. There's a circulation that arises. And a good example of this would be, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, let's say you're having a conversation with a dear friend, and you start talking about something. At first, it's just kind of chatting about this or that, but after a while, and especially, let's say you're having a spiritual discussion, each of you may find yourself having new ideas that you wouldn't have had by yourself and only would have occurred in relationship with the other person. And it has a way of just deepening and deepening. And what the mystics would say, that in that situation, a third presence arises from this relationship, that's born from this relationship, that's something that emerges. So this is the kind of reality I'm talking about, that is much richer than the usual way that we go about our business. And it involves a shift in our frame of reference, or a shift in our vantage point. So two people could be in identical, seemingly identical situations, let's say dealing with a difficult boss. And one of them is just thinking, what a censored this person is, and, you know, I'd like to stick pins in an effigy. And another way would be just going, okay, I can see how everybody, this is a difficult person, and everybody tends to react to this person and reinforces their defensiveness and their way of thinking of themselves and what other people are about. And I'm going to try to see past what's there on the surface. I'm going to try to see deeper. And so we might think, well, I could imagine being in their consciousness. And then you're thinking about, maybe you don't know anything about their life outside of work, but you go, well, maybe they have a terrible relationship with their partner, or maybe they were abused growing up, or maybe they're dealing with some serious illness in themselves or a loved one. I have no idea, but you open your heart to that person and you're relating to them with compassion instead of anger and resentment and hostility, and the situation changes. They don't necessarily magically become Mr. Rogers. They may still become gruff and whatever, but your experience with them has changed, and you've actually brought about a transformation in that situation by your manner of relating to them. Does that make sense? So
yeah, that's good.
And I really believe, kind of a phrase that came to me some time ago, that every situation without exception is a potential portal, P-O-R-T-A-L, an opening to the sacred. Even the most horrible, difficult ones, there is a way of relating to that potentially can bring about a deeper state of experience and what the possibilities of what might come through. And we have the capability in our own being of relating in such a way that we're opening doors of possibilities instead of playing the same movies over and over again, or causing the same script to be played out. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Other questions, comments, confusions? Okay, well, I shall move on. Well, historically, there's been a major gap between science and spirituality, and they just have been thought of as being just totally different domains, and science was objective, measurable, repeatable, and so on, and spirituality, depending on someone's belief system, was just, well, that's nice if they want to think that way, to, well, there may be value in it, but it's not something that we can study with our tools, so we really don't have much to say about it or to do about it. But what's happening now, I mean, there are physicists saying the most mystical kinds of things. I mean, quoting passages in the Bhagavad Gita or things present in Buddhism and using them to describe things that they're discovering about subatomic particles and so on. I mean, it's just pretty far out. And many physicists now saying that more fundamental than matter or energy is consciousness. And that's pretty radical. I mean, in the past, consciousness would have been something, no, scientists would, in fact, there's some hardcore neurologists that would say, well, consciousness is really, just something that's totally brain based, and there's really, it's not anything particularly wonderful and so on, that it's just all sitting in the brain. And then you have descriptions of countless people who've had near-death experiences describing very similar types of phenomena across cultures and across religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs. And then you go, well, it's kind of hard to believe that this is caused by oxygen deprivation, that they're having similar stories of what they're saying. And physicists saying in string theory that there's at least 10 dimensions, and some models of string theory say there's possibly 21 different dimensions. Well, that's no more mystical than the mystics saying there's 14 subtle realms of existence. It's really the same idea with different terminology that's being applied to it. I am going to be talking more about a wonderful scientist named William Tiller, but I'll say a little bit about him now. He's a professor emeritus from Stanford, and he's done research for decades now on subtle energy. I mean, real serious, replicable research. You can look him up. He's got several books. They're pretty challenging, but I think the most recent one is the most accessible. But one of his most famous experiments, he took a group of 4 experienced meditators, put them around a table, took a little bit of circuitry. So imagine that you have an old computer and you take out the motherboard and you have some tool where you can cut out a square inch of motherboard. It's not plugged into anything. Shouldn't be able to do anything, right? And you set this in the middle of the table, and the experienced meditators are asked to store an intention in this chip to either raise the pH of water in some other laboratory by 1 point or to lower it by 1 point. But let's say it's to raise it by 1 point. So they go ahead and do their meditative thing. They pack this thing up and they ship it to this other laboratory, which could be across the ocean. And the research is all automated in this laboratory. They've got a little pH meter hooked up to a beaker of water, and the data is collected by machines. There's no human intervention. The only intervention is they put this little circuitry in the same room with it. And sure enough, what happens over a period of 3 days is if the intention was to raise the pH 1 point, it goes up 1 point. Well, that's impossible by the ordinary laws of physics, right? How on earth could this bit of inert circuit board do anything? I mean, even if you dumped it in the water, it wouldn't raise the pH of water 1 point. But sure enough, it happens. And also, the thermodynamics of the laboratory itself change. And so now there's, you may be familiar with the concept of entropy. Entropy is disorder. Disorder is always increasing, according to the second law of thermodynamics. But in the room that this chip is in, entropy actually decreases, which is called negentropy, which also is impossible. I mean, how do you do that with this? But these things are happening. They've been repeated many, many times. Well, I heard William Tiller present at a convention of this group called ISEAM, International Society for the Study of Subtle Energy and Subtle Energy Medicine, and he was recounting the time that he was a speaker on a panel of distinguished physicists at some other conference. It was probably a physics conference. And he got through presenting his research, and his colleague who sat next to him was a well-known physicist, turns to William Tiller and says, even if what you're saying is true, I don't believe it. So, some people, there's a term that I've come across called scientific fundamentalism, which is every bit as much of a problem as religious fundamentalism, only for science, many people think, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's like unquestioned assumptions about the nature of reality. So if some experiment comes along that doesn't fit in with that, then the assumption is it was faked, it was shoddy research, or we're not even going to pay any attention to this. In my field of psychology, there was a study done, it's been many years now, measuring galvanic skin resistance. And they had volunteers watch a series of pictures flashed on a computer screen. And the pictures were either like beautiful things or, and some of them were just horrible things, just ugly. And they recorded their skin response, and they found out that the skin response would change before the slide was presented, let's say with the horrible content. I mean, before it, and the computer was randomly picking this, it wasn't predetermined, but the nervous system had a response to something before it even happened. And this article was published in a well-known psychology journal, and it created an uproar because people are going, this is impossible. How could you publish such a thing? This belongs in the National Enquirer or whatever. But it was done, and it also has been replicated, that we can have a response to something before it takes place from our frame of reference. So now we'll take a little segue into the world of physics. There's a term called retrocausality, which means things can have an impact in the past or in the future of things that have already happened or things that haven't happened yet. But our assumption, which we don't think of as an assumption because of course that's the way it is, time flows from past to present to future. How else could it be? But time is not like that. It all depends on our frame of reference. There's an equally valid frame of reference from another observer where what seems to us be a movement into the future, to their frame of reference is movement into the past. And there's no way of saying one's right or the other one is right. So basically, we live in a universe that is so different than what we assume it is. And this kind of thinking certainly has not gotten into the mainstream, but it hasn't even gotten to the way of thinking of most scientists, because it's very hard to shift from, Doug was asking me before we started this call if I was going to talk about paradigm shifts. The paradigm is kind of the accepted way of thinking about or body of knowledge in a particular field. And whenever there's a shift in the paradigm or the start of a shift, so someone comes up with new research or a new theory, and if it's so far different from the established, the reaction is, this is just absolutely wrong. This person, they don't belong, take away their funding, they have no business calling themselves a scientist or whatever. But then eventually, what seemed to be radically different and must be wrong becomes the new paradigm and the new way of thinking. Well, the world is going through a paradigm shift right now. Many people have rejected the old ways of belief systems that in the past people just took without question, the way that we're brought up in different traditions. And none of what I'm saying is meant to be critical of any religion. Religions have a tendency to maintain the status quo and the body of knowledge that's been there, and they tend to be very resistant to any ways of thinking that are contrary to that. But now we're at a time when people want to be able to bring their intellect into their spirituality. Things ought to be able to make sense. That at least for many people, there should not be a divide between science and spirituality. That doesn't mean that you can go into a laboratory and prove the existence of God or whatever. But if there shouldn't be different truths for spirituality and science. There can be different approaches. There can be different ways of describing experience and different language that is used to do that. So people are looking at a way to integrate different kinds of things. And this is happening in different disciplines. I mean, especially in physics. I mean, I read Scientific American, and some of the articles in there, if someone had shown me these like 30 years ago, I would go, oh no, no way, this is in Scientific American. So there was an article about time, and the conclusion was that our sense of time is really an illusion from our conditioned belief that the dimensionality that we assume is all that there is all that there is. But in a higher frame of reference, the ideas that we have about time don't apply at all. And so, oh, this is Scientific American saying things like this. I mean, serious thinkers talking about this. And I remember another article, because the physicists are looking for the theory of everything. And before quantum physics came along, physicists thought they had solved all the problems, and it was really going to just be refining decimal places in constants and so on in the laboratory. And the only thing left over they need to tidy up was what's called black box radiation, where you have something and you don't know what's inside of it, but they thought, well, there's got to be some explanation for how this takes place. And that's how quantum physics got discovered, realizing things don't move linearly or continuously. And there went the whole idea that there could be an ultimate theory of everything based on Newtonian physics. Well, now many physicists are looking for like the equation or the model that is going to be able to describe everything. But I wish I had saved it. There was an article, it was just like 2 pages long in Scientific American, written by a scientist, and it was a conceptual proof, like a thought experiment, but in easy to understand terms. This person basically proved that it would be utterly impossible for there ever to be such a thing that could explain everything. It's like, okay, guys, maybe you should stop beating your heads against the wall and look at, there's no end to the possibilities of what can be known and discovered. And I'd say, thanks. That is really a good thing that that's the case, because I would not want to be a scientist where it had all been done. I mean, what are you going to do after that? So let me pause here and again, check in and see if you have questions or comments about anything I've said, reactions. How does this have any impact? Yes, the one that's on Judith's camera, that's not Judith, but or is that you, Judith? I can't hear you, you're muted. Can't hear. Doug, can you make me full screen? And
am I
okay, Dawn can.
now I can hear you.
Okay. My question is related to consciousness and the perception of subatomic particles as having a soul, because to me, consciousness is very related to the concept of soul awareness. Is that, how does that fit into the paradigm?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You know, maybe someday the discovery will be made that everything ultimately is a manifestation of, I would say, a different degree of consciousness. So I'd be surprised if it's discovered that quarks have any individual sense of identity, or let's say a stone. But because everything is made out of matter, and matter is a form of energy, and the physicists are saying, well, all of this really arises from consciousness, there's different degrees of what's possible of consciousness. So I don't think that an amoeba has the same kind of consciousness as an animal, and certainly not the kind of consciousness that we have. So there's been an evolution of capacity for consciousness, and it's just different orders of existence. I mean, there's subatomic particles, there's atoms, there's molecules, and then there's cells, and then there's organs, and then there's organisms, and then there's beings, and so on. And there's different degrees. Well, one way of thinking about what spirituality is about, and the term is often used, it's undergoing a process of awakening. Well, awakening to what? I'd say awakening to the higher potentialities that are already inherent in our being. But one example that comes to mind is, let's say you have a new computer, and chances are your computer has many, many features you don't even know that they're there. And even if someone told you they're there, you'd have no idea what to do with them. I have a new phone, and even some of the things in the camera setting, I have no earthly idea what to do with. If I did, I could probably do some really neat things with them, but it's like they're not available to me unless I learn how to access them. Well, we have capacities for higher states of being, experiencing consciousness in relationship to what we're experiencing that goes far beyond just the physical manifestation. But because most people don't do anything about that, they have no idea that that's even a possibility. Well, guess what? Many spiritual disciplines for hundreds or thousands of years have developed technologies for being able to do this. But what keeps people from utilizing these? One is, well, I don't believe that. I'm in this tradition. I don't want to listen to what this tradition has to say. But there's just, I mean, incredible modalities of meditation that have come from Buddhism and have come from yoga that you don't have to ascribe to any belief system to benefit from. And many, many technologies for working with consciousness. And scientists are just beginning to try to figure out ways that they can research consciousness. And they have tools such as a functional MRI and so on. But that's such a, in a way, it'd be like trying to analyze a Picasso painting by scraping off chips of paint from different places and putting them under the microscope and looking at their chemical structure. I don't think you're quite going to get what Picasso is about doing that. So the old model is just reducing things to the parts and then trying to put the pieces together. Doesn't work for many, many things. It has to be a holistic and an integrative way of experiencing. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay. Does it relate to maybe vibratory levels or planes of existence? I mean, is that maybe a way to frame that?
Well, everything is in a state of vibration. And one string theory you've probably heard of believes that the smallest level are called these strings, which are unimaginably small things that vibrate in a certain way, and there's different dimensionalities of strings and so on. Talking about higher levels of existence, mystics describe these as, one way of there's different vibratory levels to be able to access these frequencies. You can't get there in your normal sitting dualistic objective state of consciousness, but there are practices by which you can get into a resonance with this and be able to experience these, depending on what capacity that you've developed. So it's a matter of, the Sufis talk about the idea of attunement, and I like to talk about coming into this state that I called relational unity involves modulating your vibration in response to that which you're relating to. So you're in kind of this harmonic resonance with what you're experiencing. And when that happens, everybody's probably had an experience of being in some just very beautiful place in nature, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, the Redwoods, whatever, where you just feel in awe and you feel this deep sense of connection, and time seems to just stand still for a while, and it's just a very wonderful experience. Well, you may have the same experience listening to some amazing music or looking at some artwork or hearing poetry or something like that just takes you beyond your usual state of being, and you are in a different vibratory state when that happens, and now much more is able to come through both to you and from you in that state. Other thoughts? Okay, so
I'll jump in before you go
Yeah.
on. Just a quick comment. I don't want to lose the thought or the thread, and I think you may address it later on. Boy, time flies, doesn't it, when you're having fun? Anyway, don't want to lose the thread of one of the things that, and maybe others here as well can comment on at some point, is it seems that there's something happening on this planet where people are beginning to question the traditional spiritual paradigms, and beginning to say that, you know, the beliefs in institutions or dogmas or creeds or what have you, that they haven't been serving us, and that they aren't functioning the way they may have functioned 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And I just wonder what your thoughts are, comments about, do you see this emerging, and then how do we use that to, in essence, heal the planet and make sure this planet continues to sustain human organisms? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think a part of the process of awakening on any authentic spiritual path is seeing beyond, freeing yourself from old belief systems, old ways of looking at the world, and especially ones that divide things of this one versus this. This is better than that one. I've got the truth. This one isn't such a good thing. And being able to see, I think more and more, many people are starting to appreciate the value and wisdom of many, many different traditions, the teachings, and being able to celebrate that, being able to, well, I'd like to listen to what this tradition has to say about such and such and that one. And that was one thing that attracted me to the particular Sufi path that I've been on, that it really drew from all the different major religions of the world, all the masters and saints and prophets. It didn't say, here's the body of knowledge, and this is what you learn, and this is it. It's what I'd call an evolutionary spirituality, and I think many people are aligned with that notion of an evolutionary spirituality that does change, that it isn't just the way that things have been, and that's not a rejection of what's been. It's like, well, what does each of us have in our own being that adds to that? What is, I mean, to me, one of the most important things is the awareness that each of our souls is so unique. And what I said about Ibn Arabi, I really believe there's something that can come through the way that we express ourselves in our lives through following our deepest passions, whether it's through work or some creative endeavor. It doesn't even necessarily have to be through something that seems like traditional spirituality, but the things that make us feel the most alive in our expression in the world, that's what we're bringing through. And for people to be able to honor that in other people of many, many different traditions, and not having a divisive way of looking at what's going on. And in terms of the crises that are going on in the world, the climate crisis, for one, I mean, there certainly is an awareness that we're all in the same boat here. You know, we may be in very different cultures and so on, but our coastal cities are all going to flood unless we do something about it. And we're going to run out of water, and there's not going to be enough food for everybody to eat, and the air burned down half the Amazon rainforest. There's not going to be as much oxygen in the world. And realizing, even if it starts out as being a self-serving need, it's realizing, well, you know, how can we let this happen to this world that we're in? And then thinking about future generations, you know, what do we want to leave to those? I mean, the people that are having that kind of awareness that is so different from a self-centered, selfish awareness of, well, and especially a materialistic one. If someone believes, well, there's just this life, so get as much as you can get out of it, and who cares about what happens after that, which unfortunately there's many people, that's the way they look at things, to if you believe that, you know, we're part of this ongoing story of existence and manifestation, that we have a rare opportunity to participate in this human form, and how would we like to use what we've been given? And to me, that would be another way of saying what spirituality is about. It's not pursuing spirituality solely for your own benefit, even if that aim is, well, I want to become an enlightened being. Well, I would say, well, and then what? Why? What are you going to do after you get enlightened? Unless they say, well, I'm just going to, this is all illusion anyway. What's the point of being here? Finding a feeling of purposefulness in our lives, that each of us really does matter, and helping to trigger that awareness in other people, whatever their path may be. So did that address what you brought up? Okay. Some of you, were any of you on the series I did previously, which was called Spiritual Awakening as Service to the World? If you weren't, there's videos of that. That was a 4-part series, but that was the whole theme of that, seeing spirituality as a way of really being of service to everything. At the same time, you're unfolding that which is the most precious to your own being. And what does it mean to participate in a collective process of awakening instead of thinking of it as just this individual thing that you're doing?
Hey, Don?
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you read to keep current on these issues? Like, what do you recommend we read if we want to stay at the cutting edge?
Oh, well, I read lots of books about physics. One, I subscribe to this little weekly thing called Science News, which is amazing. They'll take really cool things happening in different fields of science and summarize them in a not too hard to understand form. I read Scientific American, but there's a lot of wonderful books on physics. If you go to Amazon, there's one, it's not the newest one, I think it's called The Physics of Consciousness, which is a wonderful book. William Tiller's, I can't remember what his latest book is called, is just amazing. There's so much. I mean, when I retired, you can probably see the bookshelf behind me here, but I had books in my office, so I had to bring home the books from my office and make room for everything. And I took, I think it was 20 large garbage bags full of books to half-price books because I had nowhere to put them. The bookshelf is still overflowing. So I'm a real avid reader. So find something that you're curious about. Sheldrake's writings on the morphogenetic field are just fascinating. And like when dogs know their owner is coming home, just experiments that have been done. There's a website for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS, I-O-N-S. This organization was started by Edgar Mitchell, where you can tap into lectures and resources and things. So there's just so much interesting kinds of things out there. So pick something and let it whet your appetite to learn some more about it. There's a book that I just ordered about I think it's called The Secret Life of Trees. And it talks about how a mother tree, I haven't gotten it yet, but I read a little excerpt, can distinguish, like they planted seeds around it, and some of it were the seeds from the mother tree and some of it were seeds from other trees, but the mother tree could recognize its own offspring, and it would actually feed nutrients to its own offspring in the soil. It would give things from its own, just, I mean, amazing kinds of things. So, I mean, the world is so much more amazing than we think it is. So find something that's just going to put you into a state of wonder and dive in.
Awesome. Another quick question, just curious, you say you retired. What are you retired from? What were you?
Oh, I was a psychologist in private practice for about 39 years, and I loved every minute of it. I could have kept doing that for another 20 years, but I decided I wanted to do other things.
Nice.
But I loved doing psychotherapy, and sometimes I'd pinch myself when I was in a session with someone, I'm getting paid for this. I love doing this. But I love pursuing spirituality. I've got some books that I've written that if you go to the uumystics.org and click on it, in the bio, they're now all available on Amazon as ebooks. And recently I decided to write a new book because Ex Libris made me a deal I couldn't resist. So I'm going to write a new book that's probably on the topic of this series and God and science and spirituality.
Great.
I love exploring, and I love sharing what I've learned.
Thank you.
We have just a few minutes left. Any last thoughts or questions that you want to ask or desires to be addressed? And we have 3 of these left. I have to laugh at myself because, I spent a good amount of time preparing for this. And so I printed out many pages of notes, any one of which I probably could have spent quite a bit on. And I didn't get past the first page, so because I know that just things are going to come up naturally in response to what's going on. So your questions make this much more interesting, like I said, than if I was just sitting here talking the whole time. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, before we go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious, Don, if you could just highlight the things you're most likely to touch on in the next 3 sessions.
Oh, okay. Well, this is kind of like the short, long-term weather forecast, subject to change dramatically. But I'm going to be talking about different tools from different traditions for awakening. I'm going to be talking about really cool scientific research that is just mind-boggling. That even if you're very skeptical, unless you think I'm making it all up, or the people that did this research are making it all up, will challenge your usual assumptions about being in the world. I'm going to talk about what does it mean to have what I call spirituality with open eyes, not just when you're sitting there and meditating, but what is practical spirituality of being in the world, and much more so than just being a good person and following moral tenets and so on. But what does it mean to really have a spirituality that helps to foster transformation, not only in yourself, but in those that you're relating with? Not that you're trying to convince anybody of anything. It's just a way of experiencing that opens new possibilities. So those are some of the things I'm going to be talking about in the future ones.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and then unabashedly promote Dr. Don. I think, are you still doing things online classes?
No, just this, but
Okay.
I have.
You do have a website, don't you?
YouTube. Well, I have a YouTube channel, and on the YouTube channel there is a series of 6 classes called God and Science, and these were not videotaped, so it's just a still picture of me, but it's got the audio of them. And there's also the series on spiritual awakening as service to the world. So there's 10 classes that you can listen to if you so desire.
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have you join us and to lead us on these thought-provoking conversations and information. And I also wanted to let everybody know that you can go to uumystics.org, and there's the blog where you can ask more questions, make comments about each of these sessions, and Dr. Don reads those and gives him materials to address in each of the sessions. And then we also have a Facebook page, uumystics.org, and you can get into some lively discussions about mysticism and weird science, if you will. So any last comments before we close? And we'll see you next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, and that's 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
So thank you all so much for being part of this. And
All journey well. Namaste.
Namaste. See you next week.
Next week.
Thank you.